Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me this morning for an update on what's going on in Washington. Let me, obviously, I want to spend a lot of time on infrastructure, then I want to touch on a couple of other pieces of legislation, then anxious to get all your questions. Suffice it to say, this has been a extraordinarily intense last 4+ weeks as we've moved, the bipartisan group have moved from a tentative agreement with the president to a very strong vote last night, 67 votes in favor of moving to debate what will be a once in 30-year investment in infrastructure, $550 billion in new infrastructure spending that will create literally tens of thousands of jobs in the Commonwealth of Virginia, will improve our economy, will allow people to get back and forth to work, to school. It'll allow people to communicate better with broadband. It'll make sure that issues around clean water and resiliency are finally addressed. It'll make sure that we make investments in next generation industries like electric buses, and we have the possibility to manufacture those buses right here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The truth is they're going to be made in China or somewhere else. I think they ought to be made in America. Let me take you through, well, one other comment. Let me also just say, a lot of folks don't believe that Washington can get anything done. And you pick up the paper and you read about all the partisanship. I'm really proud that this group of 10 literally spent hundreds of hours together, along with the White House, to hammer out this deal. I think it's important in terms of the investments that it'll make. I think it's also important as we see an uptick in the virus, as we see some of the outrageous partisanship over in the House, to demonstrate not only to Americans but to the whole world that American democracy can still function. I hope, as we go into the dog days of August, we will be here working to get this deal done, but I hope it is a little bit of relief from some of the summer heat. Let me take a couple minutes as well and talk about specific regions to give you a little flavor of how this will affect every Virginian. In Hampton Roads, just last week I was down meeting with local leaders and business leaders, political leaders, the military, on the issue of resiliency. We've known that Hampton Roads, second only to New Orleans, is the most at risk of sea level rise. This bill puts $47 billion into resiliency. We've got a host of projects across Hampton Roads, from flood protection to water projects that will get funding out of this legislation. We also know in Hampton Roads that we need to get more rail down through the peninsula into Southampton Roads. With a $66 billion investment in rail, we will see more rail through the peninsula and Hampton Roads. Ports. We've known for a long time we want to keep the Port of Virginia competitive. That means we've got to go ahead and do the deepening. It means we've got to go ahead and do Craney Island expansion, the terminals in Portsmouth. There will be $17 billion for port infrastructure. We will get our share of that. And for something I've been working on since before I was governor, I always said, wouldn't it be great if we could finish I-64 in our lifetimes from Norfolk and Hampton Roads up to Richmond? We will have the resources with the $110 billion that are coming in to roads, bridges in this legislation to make that a reality. In Richmond, I was there last week looking at the Mayo Bridge, one of the about 700 bridges across Virginia that are in, frankly, a huge state of decay. We've got close to 14,000 bridges across the country who are in one level of deterioration or not. We will finally have money for the Mayo Bridge upgrades and bridges all across the Commonwealth. We'll also make sure that the Richmond Bus Transit System, which will be one of the largest bus transit systems in the state, I think will get additional funding. We've been working for a long time to continually upgrade all our airports, but the Richmond Airport will be part of an effort to make sure the $25 billion on airports is spread all across the Commonwealth. In Northern Virginia, I'm happy to say, and it got a little dicey at the end, that we've got a long-term reauthorization of Metro included. We've got a couple of new stations in Northern Virginia that are in the process of being built or need to be built. That will be included. There'll be dollars for expansion of VRE service to Manassas. There will a host of Northern Virginia projects in transportation can be addressed, including, as somebody who lives in Alexandria, some of the Route 1 improvements that have been long overdue. We also will be seeing, let me move a little bit further west to the Valley and Roanoke and into Southwest. We have been talking about making major improvements on I-81 for 20 years. We all know the level of truck traffic. We all know, the safety hazards on I-81. There will be resources for I-81 improvements in this legislation. We also been advocating additional rail. Let's get rail past Roanoke. Let's improve the service through Lynchburg. Let's get it down to Christiansburg and Blacksburg and hopefully even to Bristol. With $66 billion in for rail, we will be very much in the mix in expanding rail across South Side and Southwest. There's also $65 billion for broadband. I want to commend the governor again for the initiative he's put forward of using some of the rescue plan dollars, $700 million investment with these additional resources. Every community in Virginia should be able to be have fully high-speed internet connectivity at an affordable price. That is extraordinarily important for South Side and Southwest. There are additional highway projects in South Side that we're looking at, I think that might be competitive in this bill. And I also want to say, as somebody who, even back to my time as governor, knows that there are still too many families across Virginia, particularly in Southwest Virginia, that don't have everyday access to clean drinking water. This bill will have record investments in drinking water and clean drinking water. Really, really important, not just for first-time access for people who are on wells in Southwest, but for some of the old lead pipes that are all across the Commonwealth that need to be replaced. So I think this bill is extraordinarily important. Obviously, with the kind of bipartisan support, I think it will get passed. And again, these dollars will be spent out over the next 5 years plus. But the quality of life improvement and the job creation, I think it's been a long time coming, 30 years plus since we've had this kind of investment, and I was very proud to be part of the group that put it together. Let me touch on two other quick subjects before we go to questions. One, this is something that is imminent for Fort Lee and the Petersburg community. I've been strongly in favor of making sure that those Afghanis, particularly Afghan translators, who have worked with our forces and other NATO forces for 20 years as we finish our withdrawal from Afghanistan, do not be left to be massacred by the Taliban. Under President Trump, he allowed that to happen to those Kurdish allies who worked with us in Syria. I thought that was a stain on America's treatment of allies. We cannot let that happen to these individuals who've worked with us in Afghanistan literally for 20 years. So I'm hoping today, but we're trying to make sure that we have special immigrant visas. Some of those individuals will be taken to Fort Lee, about 2,500, literally in the next couple of days. And they will not be there for long. It'll just be a start of a resettlement process. These families will then meet with family members across the nation or be sponsored by communities across the nation. But it is incumbent upon the United States of America to stand by those who stood with us in the Afghan struggle. And it's a challenge. Clearly, the Taliban seem to be gaining the military upper hand, but we cannot let those who work closely with our military be slaughtered after our forces withdraw. And then I will be also reintroducing just a piece of legislation that may come back in another way as the Democrats get to the next stage of this whole process, an ability to try to bring down drug prices for kids. We've got a Medicaid drug rebate program that works pretty well in terms of bringing down prices. It's not been available to be brought to the child health insurance program, the so-called CHIPS program. I'm trying to bring that bipartisan legislation to the table as well to lower the drug prices for kids across the Commonwealth of Virginia. So lots going on. We're going to be in for the next few days or potentially for the foreseeable future as we try to get this infrastructure bill done, and then we move to the broader bill around budget reconciliation. So appreciate everybody listening in, and I'll turn it back over to you, Val, now for questions.
Okay, the first question comes from Mitchell Miller at WTOP.
Good morning, Senator. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Mitchell.
You've obviously made it over a big hurdle, and Senator Manchin a short time ago said he now supports moving ahead on a budget resolution for the $3.5 trillion package. A lot of moving parts here. What do you think now of the prospects that all of this, both packages, can get to the finish line, and what do you think are some of the biggest challenges moving ahead in the weeks ahead?
Well, infrastructure is obviously a popular item. The challenge was not figuring out where we need to make investments. Part of the challenge was how do we pay for it, since both sides took the traditional pay-fors off. Republicans wouldn't deal with taxes. Democrats wouldn't do with user fees, like a user fee for our roads. So we spent a lot of time trying to get an appropriate pay-for mechanism. I think this piece of legislation will pass. In terms of the budget reconciliation, all we're doing with the budget reconciliation is starting a process. 3.5 trillion is the top line number. It cannot exceed that, and that's over 10 years of new spending. But it will be a Herculean task to also get that done. That will require dramatic reforms in our tax code, trying to make sure that those in America who've done really well pay their fair share. Those corporations, some of them biggest being some of our tech companies, pay their fair share. But also that we look at long overdue issues like childcare, like universal pre-K, like making sure that those take care of our senior citizens at home or take care of the disabled, and that those jobs become well-paying and credible jobs. That we take on the question around how we make community college accessible and free for everyone across the country, and a host of other very important issues. The budget reconciliation, which will come right after, literally just starts the clock on trying to work out those details. Unfortunately, I think that will probably be done just by the Democrats. I don't think our Republican partners, although I'm not ruling it out, will join us on that. I'm not giving up on bipartisanship in any of these areas, but we've navigated so far. I've been the only Democratic senator involved in both of these negotiations. It's been a little bit like doing a high wire act without a net underneath, but so far so good.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question comes from Madison at WSET.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for your time today. I just have a question regarding, you pretty much touched on everything I needed to know about the infrastructure bill, but specifically I'm wondering more about, we're seeing the Delta variant spread throughout our state. Do you have any opinions or thoughts to share about a COVID mask policy returning to the Commonwealth?
Well, again, I trust Governor Northam. He's the only doctor who is a governor in the whole country at this point. I know he's looking at the data, and if the variant goes up enough, I think he will put in place what's appropriate, driven by science. But I think we're already seeing major companies across the country put in place a requirement that you either get a vaccination or that you show that you've been regularly tested. I think the VA has announced it as well. I think those of us who've been vaccinated, and let me be clear, we have more data on this vaccine than virtually almost any of the other drugs or prescriptions you may take on a regular basis. More people have received this shot both in America and around the world and we have more data on it. I know the FDA has to go ahead and grant the final approval, but clearly the vaccine is both effective and safe. And And I think the majority of us who've been vaccinated, our patience is wearing thin with those who choose not to get vaccinated. You've got a right not to get vaccinated. I agree with that. But you don't have a right to put others at risk. And this is not just about you or even your own families. But the fact is there's many folks who have been vaccinated but have younger children who are not eligible yet for a vaccine. Why put them in harm's way? I think it is I think things are starting to turn. I saw yesterday was the highest level of new vaccinations since the beginning of July. We are way past the time when this ought to be used as a political football. People need to get vaccinated. If not for yourself, do it for those who you care about. And candidly, if businesses, universities, or others put appropriate safety precautions in place so that those who are vaccinated can return safely, I think that makes a lot of sense.
The next question comes from Jacob at WRIC.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us today. You mentioned earlier that there would be some funding for local transit systems in Richmond, specifically the GRTC. I wanted to ask if you knew what form that funding would take, whether it would be targeted at specific improvements to the system or whether there would be local discretion in how that's spent.
Well, there will be local discretion, and we're still, remember, we have seen record investments in transit in the last year. We had to, in a sense, prop up many transit systems during COVID when ridership went down dramatically. In the American Rescue Plan, there was some additional dollars for transit. But in this legislation, there is literally $40 billion of new transit funding. How that will be spent out on which programs, we still have to finally work through. But a project like the GRTC, I will be very supportive of, and what I'm trying to make sure is that we do this and get these dollars down with as much flexibility as possible.
The next question comes from Lindsay at WSLS.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you for taking the time. So my story today is about the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. Recently, some data was released detailing which funds were allocated locally in Southwest Virginia, and I'm curious, can you talk about the impact you think this money can have on local venues and greater local communities as a whole, and do you think this will be enough to recoup those costs?
Luckily, we've seen the economy reopen. Again, there's been a little bit of pullback now with the Delta variant. Again, another reason to go ahead and get vaccinated. We want to make sure kids go back to school in the fall. You got to get vaccinated. But music venues, theaters, museums, they really took it on the chin because many of them, while they may have gotten a small amount of funding in PPP, their ability to reopen where you're sitting close to each other, whether it's a music venue or a museum or a theater, it's been really tough for them. The shuttered venues has been oversubscribed. There is some talk about, could we find a way to either reprogram or put some additional dollars out. I think this is one of the more successful programs. I actually want to include minor league baseball, which is important for Southwest Virginia and frankly for communities like Richmond, Norfolk, and Fredericksburg as well. Could we go ahead and include minor league ball because they actually didn't get included in the shuttered venue program. So I think when and if we get these additional dollars, we'll have to track that a little bit as we see both the, hopefully we might see a further uptick with the Delta variant, but as we really see, the number of venues that didn't make the first cut, I'm very open to seeing if we can return to that because, these venues oftentimes, they're not only direct economic drivers for the folks who work at those venues, but oftentimes that theater or club, supports a lot of ancillary businesses that are around it. Somebody goes to the theater, then you go to dinner afterwards. So, I think they are really important to kind of getting ourselves back to normal. And in so many areas, they kind of are the heart of the community.
The next question comes from Michael Martz at the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Good morning, Senator. A paired question. it looks like your infrastructure financing mechanism, the bank, got bounced from the framework. What does that what will that do to the ability to leverage money for infrastructure, infrastructure projects? And also the second half of that question is, what role do you think public-private partnerships on transportation and other infrastructure could play?
Well, Michael, as you know, in Virginia, we are a national leader in public-private partnerships. We've seen that with the HOV lanes. We've seen that with other facilities all across the Commonwealth. The challenge is sometimes they do create tolls, and we've seen in some places, like in Hampton Roads with the Portsmouth Tunnel, where frankly those tolls have gotten way, way too high. So they're not a magic solution, but when we've got record low interest rates, the ability to go out and, for example, get 50-year bonded money at under 2%, it's crazy not to have that tool in our toolkit. I was very disappointed that the infrastructure bank got taken out. There were some concerns over some of the labor provisions. I've actually been in touch with both the labor and business coalitions to see if they might be able to help forge a compromise so that I could potentially get it back in, even on this bill. And there's broad bipartisan support on that. But if we're not successful, I clearly hope to revisit this in the reconciliation process. We need to use this tool, not only for things like traditional infrastructure, but as we think about things like, how do we make sure if you've got an electric vehicle that there are appropriate charging stations out there? The government shouldn't have to pick up the whole cost of that, but the government might seed some initial dollars and then put out a very long-term low-interest loan so that you could build these charging stations, and at some point there'll be some fee for that, and that would be the fee that would, in a sense, repay those funds. So whether it's EV charging stations, whether it's smarter power grid, whether it's traditional bridges and roads, water and sewer systems, using public-private dollars in a way that makes business sense and sense for the taxpayers, we'd be crazy not to put that into the process.
The next question comes from Paul Lara at Inside Nova.
Good morning, Senator. About the interpreter rescues, you said 2,500 are coming to Fort Lee. How many in total, and why is Fort Lee such an ideal location for this?
Well, in total, this universe, depending on how many folks go through the application process, we also have to kind of up the number of special immigrant visas. And again, this is something that is broadly bipartisan. There are potentially a range of 30 to 50,000 that could take place over the next number of months, because I think all our fears are is, we've got most of our troops out as NATO pulls out its troops. If the Taliban make increased military success, we've seen the first people they go after are oftentimes these translators who worked with American forces. In total, with their families, it's between 30 and 50,000. DOD chose Fort Lee, and again, let me be clear, these are just people coming through in transit. It is expected they will not be at the fort for more than a few days to make sure they're processed and then, in a sense, settled in other communities. DOD made that choice, but I think it was because Fort Lee has the type of facilities to be able to house this kind of surge of population. We've seen that in deployments of our own troops, that Fort Lee has that capacity to surge up and then cut back down. And I've been very proud that the overwhelming majority of Virginians and local elected officials and others have said, this is something we need to do as a moral responsibility of the United States when we have a foreign policy to protect those who help protect our troops. But again, I want to make clear that these people are just passing through in transit. And Fort Lee, I think, has those capabilities.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one final question, and that comes from Amy Knowles at the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warren, thanks for taking our questions. with the money from the proposed infrastructure bill, would localities have an opportunity to submit proposals about what they need and how many dollars could fix the issues, or would the state or federal government allocate money as they see fit?
Well, it's mostly going to be running through traditional programs that, for the most part, go from the Fed then down to the state, and if it's a VDOT project, but there are certain water and sewer projects that the locality will make the application to. So it is. There's not a single answer, and I would point out one of the things that I want to continue to make the point. Both the state and localities. The state got $4.3 billion in the March plan. The localities got close to $3 billion in the American Rescue Plan. Those were one-time dollars. I really hope the state and the localities will be good stewards of those dollars and think about making investments in infrastructure as well. I'm really proud that the governor has taken some of our federal dollars and some of these state dollars and launched a $700 million broadband initiative. I think that's the right way to leverage. If we get additional broadband dollars, and there will be, we can supplant some of those. But my hope is, we all have to be very good stewards of these dollars. But most of these dollars in terms of the new infrastructure, and they will not be all kind of coming so quickly. This will be spent out over a 5+ year time frame. And I think that's really important because remember, we have put close to $5 trillion just in the last 16 months, and most of that under President Trump, into the economy. So as we think about these longer term capital improvements, as a business guy, I've always thought we did a crazy way of budgeting. There's operating expenses versus capital expenses. These are almost 90% plus going to be long-term capital expenses. They will pay out benefits for 30 years plus when you replace a bridge or build a highway or replace lead pipes with new water pipes. So, but most of these will go through existing programs. But thanks everybody, and again, it was I think a great first step. I kept making the analogy that this group was going to propose, closing a bipartisan infrastructure deal as the next new Olympic sport. It was that difficult, but so far we stuck the landing, and now we just got to make sure we to keep using this analogy, bring home the gold for the whole country and the Commonwealth. Thanks.